Hey there, educators. Welcome to another episode of Higher Ed Hot Takes. I'm your host, Ashley Berry, and the CEO of the Higher Ed Institute. Today's episode is going to be focused on grading for equity. And we have two very special co-hosts with us today. We have Zola Aponte and we have Angela de Dios. You guys could take a second and just introduce yourself briefly to the audience for us.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Zola Ponte. I have been working in higher education since 2009 in a few different roles. And then for the last, starting my third year right now, I am teaching Introduction to Sociology. And I am doing that at a couple of different institutions.
Hi, everyone. I'm Angela de Dios. I teach psychology. I have been teaching since 2011. As an adjunct, and then I got a full-time position in 2016, and so have been happily doing that ever since.
Very cool. Okay, so the reason why I had asked the two of you onto the show today is because, Zola, you recently started to implement an alternative grading system into your class. And Angela, you've been doing it for how long? You've been doing it for a while now, right?
Yeah, I actually got exposed to it in January of 2021, and so I've been sort of dabbling in it since then.
Very cool. Very cool. And so I just wanted for my audience members out there who have no idea what alternative grading is or grading for equity or ungrading, there's a number of ways that we can call it, right? I just kind of wanted to give folks an idea of what is sort of an umbrella understanding of what alternative grading is.
I think Angela should take this since she's been doing it longer.
Okay.
I can pitch in.
Sure. I mean, like when we think of grading, we always think of this sort of traditional thing where you assign points to assignments or to exams, you add up those points, you come up with a percentage at the end, and that's the grade that you receive at the end. That's sort of the traditional grading route. Alternative grading is anything that does it differently, that reimagines how can we actually assign a grade. I mean, because as educators, we are beholden to the system and we do have to assign a letter grade by the end of the semester. But alternative grading as an umbrella has different ways of getting to that letter grade than you would typically think of.
So it's not necessarily throwing out your A through F letter grade system, because you can't do that, right? Well, some colleges and universities have done that, but we aren't that progressive, right?
Yeah.
So what initially sort of got you into this, and what are more or less the pitfalls of the traditional grading system, or why have folks chosen to go in sort of a different direction?
Yeah. So for me, I am a lifelong learner. And so I'm always signing up for different professional development activities. And our college actually had a workshop with Joe Feldman, who wrote the book Grading for Equity. And that was my first exposure to any alternative grading practice. I went to this workshop and I was in disbelief. I had been so ingrained in traditional grading for so long, with my education and then like being a professor, right? Just this is how we do grades. And in that talk, he said, well, why? Why does it have to be that way? And my first reaction was like, there's no way that this is going to work, right? But then I actually sat down, I read his book, and a lot of the ideas made sense. In his book, he made the argument that when we think of grades, we have to reflect on what should they represent. And for me, a grade should represent a student's understanding of the course material, right? And he argued that a lot of what we do in traditional grading actually doesn't represent that. For example, when we have students submit an assignment, if they submit it on time, then they get the credit for it. But if they submit it late, then you deduct a percentage of it.
Right.
So now that grade no longer represents the student's understanding, but it represents the student's punctuality. And then you have things in there like extra credit.
Or grammar.
Things that aren't representative of the student's understanding of that course material. So I started to think, well, I want it to. I want that grade to be a reflection of that. And so that's when I started sort of dabbling in it, because I really looked at, well, what does that grade represent, right? I thought of students where they turned in all their assignments. They were very punctual. They're good students. But when I looked at their exam scores, they were not doing well. They didn't really get it. And they would come out of my class with an A. And I would shake my head and be like, I mean, I guess, right? Because
Right.
they're good students, right? They're
Mhm.
doing the work.
Mhm.
And then I thought of other students too, where they seem to be doing well and understand it, but like because of life circumstances, they'd miss one too many assignments,
Yeah.
and then they wouldn't pass the class. And like I would just feel heartbroken in those situations. And so that's when I really started to think, well, maybe this traditional grading is just not what I want it to be for my students.
Right. And similarly, too, I think when you were talking about exams, we have so many students too that have a really difficult time with taking exams because of test anxiety and things like that. And I was very much one of those students. It took me years of practice to kind of get over that. And so again, when we're thinking about like how we are actually grading our students, if we are putting someone under pressure and they are just freaking out the entire time that they're taking the exam, am I actually measuring what they're learning, or am I measuring how well they are able to take an exam? So those were other reasons too for me that really stood out to me as a student and then working and coming into higher education.
Something else that comes to mind when I think about alternative grading methods is equity, right? We have students that come into our classes and essentially, especially if they're coming into the community college, they're all getting a brand new start, right?
Mhm.
We're not placing them into remedial classes based on how they did in high school. We're not taking into consideration what classes would be best for them because of a disability that they have or because they have 20 years of experience working in the world, right? And then coming back as like adult learners. So we have students that are at very different levels. And is it really fair? This is what got me thinking about alternative
Mhm.
grading. Is it really fair to measure all of the students at the same, to have the same standards for all of the students, regardless of what level they're starting out at, right? A student with a learning disability versus a student who was in honors in all of high school, or an adult learner with 20 years of experience versus an 18-year-old that comes in with no life experience. And so the idea of alternative grading is taking into account that despite students starting at different levels in their classes, right, that they're all going to have the same opportunity to succeed.
Yeah.
Right. So I loved that point when I was doing a little bit of research. But so I'm a visual person, right? And I know on a podcast, it's impossible for us to show charts or, to explain in the best way that you both can explain how your methods work. Because I know that there are different ways of doing it depending on, the discipline that you teach or the learning modality or your personal pedagogical strategies, right? So if you guys could, the best that you can describe how your particular system works in your class.
Like I mentioned to you before, a lot of what I've learned, I learned from Angela, or actually I took from Angela because she is kind of the person that introduced me to this topic to begin with. But we do have very different ways of actually grading and teaching our classes. And I'm still learning. So there's I think this will be my third semester doing this, and I am finding that there's things that I want to change every single semester. And again, it has to do with things like what you kind of mentioned previously, right? That you're like, "Oh, okay, you walked away with an A, but should this student maybe possibly actually have gotten an A? Like, yeah, they did all the work, they were a great student, but just the way that we're looking at things." So for me, it's really been redesigning my rubrics, and it's looking at like how do I actually measure my student learning outcomes within my rubrics. So I've taken a hard look at all my rubrics and changed those out. And then I do still believe that exams are a valid way of doing things, but I leave them all because again, with equity, I don't believe that we should have a time limit because I do believe that that causes anxiety. And I also think that there should be multiple attempts. And I do that because I believe that students learn every single time that they retake an exam. They don't see the correct answers. So if they want to actually get the correct answers and some of those questions shuffle, they will have to actually sit down and read the chapter and figure out where those questions are coming from. So if they want a good grade on those few exams, they have as many times as they want to take it, but they still have to actually go through the textbook and read it, right? So with them taking it multiple times, I do believe that they're learning. And then with my other assignments, these weekly assignments that I have to actually check their understanding, those have been fluctuating for me. So that's one of those areas where I'm considering changing it up a little bit. And I am probably going to take a little bit from Angela. So Angela, why don't you go ahead and explain what you're doing so that I can talk about that after.
Sure. So it really depends for the course that I'm teaching. For my content courses like intro psych or developmental psych, my standard sort of model for a week is the students have the reading. They have to watch a lecture video that has embedded questions within it. So that's considered their homework, their quote unquote homework. In terms of my grading practice, homework isn't included in the grade. Homework is really there as a learning tool for students. And so if they submit it late, like it doesn't have a negative impact on their grade. They also have video discussion boards. So these are for async class, for example. So instead of like a written discussion board, I like video because it helps with student engagement. And then I have what I call demonstrates. And these are a summative assessment for every single chapter of the course where they have an opportunity to share what they know about that chapter. Now, my demonstrates are not exam based. They're really sort of open. I give maybe like 3 to 5 different options for prompts. They can be things like interview someone about this, create an infographic about this, have a video about talking about nature and nurture in this aspect of development. So it really depends on the chapter. They vary widely. And I give students an opportunity to submit something else that they wanted to create in consultation with me, of course. So every week they have those 3 things. They have the video lecture, they've got the video discussion, and then they have the demonstrate. So in the grading structure, they have to submit X number of video discussions on time in order to meet standards. I give a lot of wiggle room on that because the on-time piece, sometimes life gets in the way. The demonstrates, however, they do have to meet a certain standard for those demonstrates for 13 out of the 14 demonstrates for the entire semester. And those, I give them an opportunity to submit late. I give them an opportunity to submit and then get feedback from me and then resubmit as many times as they need to in order to meet standards.
Now, there's a certain time limit that you give them to resubmit each one of those demonstrates.
Correct. Yeah.
And this next semester, I think you mentioned it was 2 weeks.
Correct. Yes.
So we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but time frame wise for you grading these, because I know that it's pretty timely. I mean, to grade an infographic or to watch a video and to make sure that they're meeting all of the standards on your rubric, that can take a really long time. And you teach what, 4 or 5 classes?
I teach 5, yeah.
5 classes. How do you make sure that every single student is meeting the standard within that 2-week period so that they can resubmit and resubmit and resubmit?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Zola mentioned rubrics. I have a very simplistic rubric in my class because I don't use points. And so either students meet standards or they need revision.
Right.
And so it's really actually quite easy to look at an infographic or to listen to a video submission and to say, oh, yeah, they got it. Or to say, well, maybe they kind of got it, but they need more detail. Or I didn't see evidence that they pulled from the textbook. Like, I want to see more of that. And so really the determining the grade is the quick part. It's the giving feedback that maybe takes a little bit longer. I try to streamline that by giving audio feedback.
Okay.
And so I just record myself saying, hey, I really enjoyed this demonstrate. I think you needed a little bit more detail from the chapter. I would have liked you to mention this. I'd like you to mention this. So please make sure to revise and resubmit. Remember, we've got 2 weeks to do that, but the sooner the better. So if you need more, then I can give you more feedback.
Oh, okay.
And I think the rubric really is the key too. When you have a well-established rubric and you know exactly what it is that you are going to grade on, then it makes it really easy to cross-check your rubric with the work that the student is submitting. If you don't have a rubric, then it becomes very much like this feeling, this like, you're grading based on what you think.
Subjective.
And yes, very subjective, very biased in some cases too. So when you have a well-established rubric for all of your assignments and you know what it is, exactly what you're planning to look at, and the student knows that well, it becomes easier for them to submit the assignment, and it becomes a way faster for you to actually grade those assignments too.
Okay, so both of you do pass, no pass on all of your assignments. That's what I understand is there's the rubric, which breaks down exactly what you're looking for. And let's say you have 4 things listed on your rubric. 3 out of those 4 things are met, but the 4th thing is missing. It's a no pass, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost as though they never turned it in the first place because they wouldn't get any credit on it. It wouldn't be like A, B, C, D system. How do students respond to that? Like, I got almost everything right except for this one little thing.
I actually have not had any negative feedback from my students at all, to be honest. Instead, it's been the opposite, where when they have the rubric and they're able to tell, and then when I do provide feedback at the end and I'm letting them know, so you did these 5 things, but remember you needed to submit these 8 things. So there's a couple of things that are missing, or 3 things that are missing. So, and then I tend to spell them out, like make it really detailed. Like, these are the 3 things that I would like to see. So please make sure that you resubmit for full credit. And then they do it. Or they'll get back to me and just say, I'm sorry, I'm just not going to turn it in. Like, and that might be the case too. But a lot of times what I've noticed is that the students that are not completing the work, they're just not they're just not completing the work. They're going to be doing that for almost everything. Whereas the students who are completing the work, they complete the work without any issues. Like, I think you're always going to have that students, right? If you think about how we've been doing traditional grading, you're going to have those students where you read a paper and you're like, this paper blew me away. And then you're going to have a paper from a student that you're like, this is barely passing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, with whatever that might be. And it's the same. It's just about the student's willingness to engage with the material most of the time. It's not you as an instructor. It's not the way that you're grading. It's not necessarily, the rubric or the assignment itself. It's just whether or not this student actually wanted to apply what they were doing. So that's what I've found most of the time. I don't know if you have a different perspective.
Yeah, it's really interesting. If they have met, like, whatever, 4 out of the 5 points in the rubric, I'll say, hey, you did great on this, this, and this. I just need this one little thing from you. And like, they don't have to redo the entire thing. And that's the beauty of the resubmission is I'm not asking you to redo everything. I'm just asking you to supplement and give me this one piece that you were missing. Okay. So they find, oh, that's fair, right?
Yeah, right?
I think in a traditionally graded class, if you take an exam and then you didn't do it, you don't get an opportunity to fix your mistake. Mm-hmm. And so I think that they appreciate that.
Yeah. In most cases, like, I teach and grade everything in Canvas, right? So if they do an infographic, for an example, because I also have those as options. So if they submit an infographic and then I'm noticing that a couple of things are missing in that infographic, then I allow them to turn that in the comment section. So they don't actually have to resubmit the entire infographic if there was only a couple of things, right, that were missing. So then I let them know, and then they just submit a comment section to me and explain those few areas that were missing. So I found that has worked really great. Or, they record an audio or something like that, but just something that they can put into the comment section, but without having to take back the assignment and redo it.
Okay, I like that. That's actually a really good idea. So I wanted to talk about the criticisms of this, right? Because there are a lot of naysayers out there that say, like, this is, alternative grading is a hoax and it's no good. So I wanted to go back first to the idea of timing. So as I'm thinking about alternative grading systems, I'm thinking about working for like the Cal State or the UC system. There's a lot of folks that teach enormous classes, right? Like Intro to Communications has maybe like 200 people in a lecture hall, right? And or even the more specialized classes can be enormous, 75 students, right? Even 45 to 50 students, a lot of students. So for the folks that go, I love this idea, but how in the world would I implement this system for one class of 200 students when I have 4 classes that I'm teaching and, 600 students, right? What would be your advice to those folks?
My advice would be to start small. When I first started, I jumped in, right? And by the end of the semester, I was teaching statistics and I was doing retakes of like different assessments, like until the wee hours of the morning. I was like up on Zoom with students until midnight for the finals week, right? Like every night. And I just had a mountain of grading to do at the end. And I was like, okay, I can't, that was a bad idea. I shouldn't do that. So my advice would be to start small. You don't have to do reassessments on every single assessment that you have. Try it for one assignment. See how it goes. See what the workload looks like.
Mm-hmm.
That would be my biggest advice, is to just start small, like dip your toes in. If you're curious about alternative grading, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing.
Mm-hmm.
You can still maintain your same grading structure. Just try it on one assignment and see what happens.
Yeah, I would suggest the same. I think that a lot of times when we as educators, we want to adopt something, we just dive into it, right? And we tend to overwhelm ourselves with the amount of maybe rework that we have to do because we want to just be this all or nothing, right? Like, yes, I want to do this. I think it's excellent. And so we just want to go all out. But usually that is not a good idea, especially when we're not comfortable or familiar with what exactly it is that we want to do or what the outcome is going to look like. So starting small, if you have a couple of assignments in mind that you could maybe change out a little bit, again, making sure that you have a rubric for those assignments, and then seeing how that would look like for one class. And then if you liked the way that you did that for that one class, then maybe you can make that change for, all of your classes.
An additional thing I would hop in with is, once you do experiment with it and you're like, I like this, I want to put this at scale, you really have to evaluate the assignments that you're giving to your students. And when you really look at all of the assignments that you give, think about, are they all necessary? Are they all really going to help me to determine their level of understanding? And if it's not, don't give it, right? There's nothing that says we have to give X number of assignments throughout the entire semester. We really want to give meaningful assessments. And so once you cut down the number of assignments that you provide, then there's less grading.
Yeah.
And that's why you don't take into account the embedded quizzes, right? That's why you don't, because it's not assessing their learning necessarily.
That's right. It's more formative for them.
Yeah.
Right. And you also mentioned to me that you do not give exams at all. Like those demonstrates, you use those in place of exam.
Correct.
So how has that worked out? Like, I'm curious because I still give exams, right? And my exams are half multiple choice, half like, I'll ask them to like kind of analyze what they've read or what they've, a video that I've had them watch and include like psychological theories and concepts. And that's the way that I've been able to assess their learning. But I'm curious as to know, what your reasoning behind getting rid of your exams is and how that's worked out for you so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to make it clear that you can absolutely do alternative grading with exams and sort of more traditional assessments. I, like I said, am a lifelong learner, and so I'm always trying to figure out different ways to engage my students. And so, especially with artificial intelligence and the temptation for students to use that, maybe to shortcut their learning, I thought about, well, how can I give students assessments that, one, are going to be a more authentic representation of their understanding, two, that they could use AI for, but they are going to use AI in a way that's going to help them with their learning instead of shortcutting their learning. And so I made the jump to use authentic assessments, culturally relevant assessments. And so that's when I really sort of got rid of the exam piece of it. I've really enjoyed it. I do a lot more video-based assignments. And in an online asynchronous class, it used to just be like, you read paragraphs from students every week.
Like
and
with discussion boards.
Yeah. And you don't really get to know them.
And it's very surface.
It is.
Yes.
It is. And so with these video demonstrates, like, I get to know them so much better. I put a face to a name. I hear their voice. I see them every week.
Right.
And then I respond to them with audio clips.
Uh-huh.
And they comment a lot by the end of the semester. Like, I feel like I got to know my classmates. I feel like you were always there guiding me every single week.
Which is really important for RSI, right? Is
For
that you
sure.
want students to feel connected, a sense of community, right?
Yeah.
So, and by the way, we are going, audience members out there, we are going to talk about authentic assessment in another episode. So if you're interested in learning more about that, please stay tuned. But yeah, I wanted to talk also about this idea of grade bloat and rigor. When I think about the community college as sort of the starting point for a lot of our students, we know that a great majority of them are going to transfer into the Cal State and into the UC system, right, to finish their degrees. Not all of them, but a lot of them will. So I think there's always this concern: are we preparing them properly to take on the rigors of these upper level classes that they're going to be taking once they transfer? So my question is that this isn't a very commonly used grading method. That there aren't a lot of people that are adopting alternative grading or grading for equity. So they are going to enter into a university that expects them to do it right the first time, right? That has them taking these long multiple choice exams or doing these papers that take into account things like grammar, APA, tone, all of these different things. So when people talk about grade bloat, the worry is you're allowing them to continue to do the work over and over again until they get an A. But is that A really reflective of the things that they need to know to be successful as they, continue on and go further, right? Because there's also this idea that college is meant to set students up for success in the workplace. So if students are turning things in, to their boss 7 different times, like at some point the boss is going to go, I thought you were ready for this job, right? Or you didn't grammar or spell check your work, right? And so I wanted to address that. I wanted to address grade bloat and rigor as something that might be a concern for professors that are listening in and going, we're going to get these students and they're going to go, how come I can't do this assignment 27 times or whatever, however long it takes to get it right, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because when I first shared the system with a tutor that I was using in my class, she said, wow, everyone is going to get an A. This is going to be great. And that is not what
That's not the case. Yeah.
That is not what happened. And here's the interesting thing. I think that students learn the game of education. They learn I have to jump through as many hoops as I can to earn as many points as I can. And then I can coast the rest of the semester once I've hit the number of points I need.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And the focus is no longer on learning, and it's more on point grabbing.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my biggest pet peeve, is when students would raise their hand in class and be like, is this worth points? How many points is this worth?
Right.
And it would drive me insane. I really wanted them to learn for learning's sake and not just for the points. And so I feel like this idea of rigor, right? Oh, well, if they can just keep trying, then it's not a rigorous class. Then it's easy. But that's actually the opposite, because in a traditionally graded class, you take the test, you don't know it, you move on, and you make up for those points with extra credit or with other things. And you don't actually have to learn the material from that exam. Whereas in my class, I say, okay, you didn't get it this time, but that's okay. But I still expect you to learn it. Right. And that's where students, at the end of the semester, they would come up to me and they would say, I felt like I actually learned in this class because you forced me to.
Yeah.
If I wanted to get that grade, I had to show that I actually understood it. And so for me, I think that it really actually elevated the rigor and the expectation for my students.
And I think when we're thinking about ungrading too, I think some of those challenges comes into like, well, how do you actually grade then? Like, what does it look like for a student at the end of the term? If we're talking about like when you are removing points and then how does the student actually show? So it becomes a matter of how many of something did they turn in, right? And then I think also something that's really important is that we go back to our student learning outcomes. A lot of assignments, if I think back on assignments that I've taken as a student, right, through the course of my educational journey, there were a lot of assignments that really didn't do anything for the actual student learning outcome. It wasn't a build up to a different assignment. It was just, here's something for you to do, right? And so I think when we're talking about too, like actually removing the assignments that sometimes we spend time grading, but that really doesn't have anything to do with those student learning outcomes, we are creating, again, more of that balance with how much we're grading, but then also what the student is learning and what we are requiring them to understand. So with my exams, for an example, I mentioned those. Those are something that they have to do to, again, engage with the course material, right? But it's not necessarily something that's going to majorly affect their grade. So instead of those demonstrates that Angela does, I do case studies. And so again, relative assignments, and I try to make them authentic in a way where they apply case studies to things that are happening within, like, I create these fictitious case studies, right? Like something that happened in the work environment. There was a big political change or something like that. From a sociological perspective, how would you analyze this? What is it that's happening? And then I also always have a personalized experience with that. Like, tell me about a time where you might have experienced something similar and then apply the material to it, right? And so it's like either they did it or they didn't. And they really have to think about how this happened to them, has happened to them, or how they've seen it happen to someone else in a different scenario. And I always try to make sure that those are really relevant to, either the college students. I teach a lot of dual enrollment courses as well, or so to the high school environment. So depending on the courses that I teach. So I think when we think about like how we are changing up our assignments, when they find relevance in what they're doing, it doesn't really become bloat, right? It doesn't really become something that is just this thing that they have to do, but they actually find relevance in it and
Like
can then
connect to it.
yes, exactly, and can see why it matters and why it would matter in the world of work once they are done.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And relating that back to like transferring to university, right? At least in my experience, when I was in university, it was like 3 exams and that was it.
Yeah.
So all of the formative assessments, there were no quizzes, there was no homework to boost my grade. And so in my class, I sort of replicate that. The like video assignments, that's for them to learn. And it's really showing them it's on you to do whatever you need to do to learn the material so that by the summative assessment, you can show me what you know. So in that way, that prepares them if they're in a more traditionally graded environment that, oh, I need to do these things to help me learn so that I can perform on these summative assessments.
Right.
Both of you have done the traditional grading method, or did you start out? Because I know you said you've been teaching for almost 3 years now, right? So when you first started, you were using the traditional grading method. Can you guys tell me what the difference in engagement looked like? Like maybe give me some examples of how students engaged in your traditional grading method classes versus how they're engaging now, and what that looks like if it was positive or negative.
I do think that engagement has always been pretty high in most of my courses. I teach more in person than I do online. So I should probably mention that as well. But I do have online courses as well. But I think that there was just a lot more back and forth because I have always given the opportunity to redo assignments. So even when I did grade traditionally, they always had those opportunity to redo. And I found that with the traditional grading environment, like for them to gather those points, right? In many cases, they wouldn't apply themselves to get an A. It would be like, I'm just going to get that C and then I'm going to be done, right? I'm going to do all the things in this bracket, in this rubric column to get the C and then I'm done. But now that they don't really have that option, I do find that I get a lot more robust assignments. And my students, just similarly to what you were saying, they walk away and they say, wow, Sola, this was one of the best classes I've ever taken. Like, I learned so much. And that has been really nice to hear. And I didn't really hear that part in my first couple of semesters when I did have the traditional grading method. I've always had that this was a great class, but not like I really learned, right? Because they could choose what level of application they wanted to put in, whether they wanted a Z or wanted an A, right? But now all of the assignments that are submitted are robust. So I've really appreciated that. But again, there's been, I've had discussions in the past, and I don't really like discussions because I think that they're very surface, right? So there's some things that I'm still rethinking and trying to reimagine a little bit. But I think engagement has been high, but it's been more like pick and choose in the past versus now it's always application.
Okay.
Yeah, for me, I think that when I was doing traditional grading, I would give my students feedback because I think that feedback is really essential for student learning. And I would bump up against this frustration of, are students even looking at my feedback? And I think that we've all been there. Like, we spend all this time giving this feedback, and then students do not seem to be taking that feedback and using it. And so I think that the biggest change for me has been seeing that students do look at the feedback, that they value the feedback, actually. I think that feedback can be taken as criticism, or it can be taken as, oh, she wants me to grow and learn. And I think that that shift to the alternative grading has really made that shift for students. They view my feedback as, oh, she cares. She wants me to succeed, instead of, she's just like being nitpicky or like doing that to bring me down. The second big piece that I've taken away from it is I have students, and I'm sure that you all have students like that, who start off strong, something in their life happens,
Right,
and they disappear for a little bit. And then for most traditionally graded classes, they've missed too much. They hit that point, and that's it. They're going to fail the class.
Yeah.
And those are my heartbreaker stories, right? Like, you're like, you were doing so well, but now there's nothing I can do. But with my alternative grading structure, students can come back. And I've seen students like that, where they were on track to fail the course. They really buckled down. They worked really hard in the last 3 weeks of the semester. They come out with an A or a B.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right.
And I'm like, yes, this is why. This is why I do this.
Right.
Yeah.
Because we don't want to see our students fail, right? That's obviously not the point of having the class or having them go. We want to see them succeed.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Can I pitch in and just one thing what you were mentioning about feedback too? I think that's another really important part too, is like when you don't really allow students to submit an assignment, right? Here you are as an instructor, you have this assignment, you're providing all this feedback, right, to the student. But when you are not allowing them to resubmit that assignment, they are not learning from that feedback. That feedback is just there, and that's it. There's nothing for them to do with it, because there's no way that student's going to sit down and redo that assignment with your changes and be like, great, I did it. I learned this extra thing, right? No, they're not going to do that unless you actually provide them the opportunity to submit it again. So with feedback, I think that's another really important part when you're considering, whether you are teaching those traditional or a grading in a traditional sense versus the ungrading methods, right? Because you give the opportunity or the students the opportunities to actually resubmit and learn.
yeah, and on the faculty side of things, I've had quite a few conversations with faculty that have given up on giving feedback because they feel like it isn't valued, it isn't taken seriously, students don't read it. And so I've had quite a few faculty that go, I used to be so detailed and write them a whole paragraph, or I'd put annotations all over their paper, and they'd never even look at it, never even knew that I gave it to them. Like, you'd sit down and have a conversation with them and they'd go, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about, right? And so I think that this would also minimize some of the frustration that faculty feel when they do give out that feedback because they know that students are reading it and understanding it and taking it seriously. So just out of curiosity, have you guys seen like a increase in the amount of students that get A's and pass your class since implementing this system? Do you feel like there are more A students than there were prior?
A few, not significantly. It's definitely not one of those like, okay, well, all of a sudden, it took my entire class from, C's to A's, right?
Right.
Because it's still on the student. Because if they have, you know, let's say 16 assignments that they have to turn in, and that's maybe in one of the assignment brackets, right? And they have to turn in 14 out of those 16 to get an A. There's going to be times, just like what we mentioned, we have a lot of times where they're just so busy one week that week they're just simply not turning in an assignment, right? And so I think if anything, I see the students completing their assignments to get that, complete, right? Or completed in the rubric, right? They do that. But more often than not, the grade that's reflecting is the fact that they're just not submitting assignments on some weeks. Not that they're not putting in effort into the assignment, but that they're just choosing not to submit an assignment instead. And so when we're looking at the grade and I'm going through the grading, it's okay, so this student is getting a C because they didn't submit like 6 assignments, right? They just simply didn't do it. Right. So those are where I've noticed if anything, where my students are, either failing or getting those lower grades is because they're just not doing the work.
Okay.
Yeah, for me, it's funny. It depends on the level of the class. Like for my intro psych classes, grade distribution has remained pretty much the same. But for my more upper level classes, lifespan development, statistics, research methods, those have definitely seen a shift to more A's and B's. I've basically not really given any D's. Like it's weird. It's either they pass or then they fail because I still have students who fail, right?
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
For those students who are just not engaging. So it's really interesting. I don't know why. Like the D grade has just kind of disappeared in my classes.
That's different. You would think that the opposite trend would be happening, that you would be your easier classes the A's would be going up, right?
Yeah.
But I guess those upper level classes, they hold a lot of weight when you're transferring to, right? Like if you're a psych major, you need to pass your statistics class, right? So if you're thinking about it in that way, yes, I could see where that would be a trend. So just one last question before we wrap up the episode. So, we've introduced the world of alternative grading to our audience, and, we've given some concrete examples. We've talked about how it's affected students. The last question that I have for both of you is for those of us who are out there and we've piqued their interest and they're going, okay, so now I want to learn more about it, or I want to dip my toes into one or two of my assignments, but first I want to do some research on it. Are there any good resources, authors, researchers out there that you could quote to let folks know how they can go about getting started understanding alternative grading or grading for equity?
Yes, absolutely. I've got a list. So Joe Feldman's book, Grading for Equity, is where I started. The Grading for Growth blog is actually what I read. It's by David Clark and Robert Talbert. They are fantastic. The blog is available. They put out posts weekly. They also have a book, which I have not read. As an educator with a 5-5 load and 2 small children, I don't have time to sit down and read an entire book often. So I rely on that blog. I also listen to the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast by Bonnie Stahoviak. Lots of different topics, but a lot on grading too. And then I know that Linda Nilsson wrote a book on specifications grading. I've not read it, but I've heard good things about it. And then there's also the grading conference. That is a yearly Zoom conference where they talk about all things alternative grading. I have not attended, but again, have heard really good things.
So the whole entire conference is about grading.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really crucial if you're going to get into this world that you connect with other faculty who are toying around with these ideas too, because it's hard to sort of do it in solo, like as an individual, but really in connection with others. I think that that's really key, is to find someone else who's interested in this also and to connect with them.
Yeah. Honestly, when I started learning, I have not sat down and read a book or anything like that, right? So that's not how I've learned. So I don't have a wealth of, titles to give out. But I just started researching in general, just sitting down and Googling and sometimes even using AI to come up with some of the prompts and like how to lay certain things out can be incredibly helpful. And then for me, some of those experiences have been through also conferences and seminars, right?
You went to a really good one over the summer, right?
Yeah, so this past summer, well, first of all, the online teacher conference in Long Beach, that one does cover some of those topics as well. So that's been a really great one. But then the Great Teacher Seminar.
Yes.
So the Great Teacher Seminar was hosted in San Diego last summer, and it was probably one of the absolute best experiences that I've ever had. And there were a lot of conversations about how we grade, what we do. And so these conversations came up and I got so many amazing ideas of like, how actually grading for equity looks like. So talking to other people, that's really one of the biggest. Yeah. And for whatever reason in higher education, we very rarely come together to actually talk about teaching and grading strategies. I don't know why, but I don't think I've ever had like an actual grading and teaching conversation with anyone that works on my campuses. It's just when we're meeting outside or when I'm meeting with educators from other institutions. So talk to people. That's what I would recommend.
Well, and I think, because we've been since kindergarten, we've been so ingrained in this grading system, right?
Yeah.
That it's hard to imagine that there are other ways to do this.
Right.
And I love that you guys are more or less the pioneers, some of the pioneers, right? Because I myself, I have not implemented this, but it's something that's got me thinking about it now. So hopefully for all of those watching or listening out there, we hope that you learned something from this particular episode about grading for equity, and that we can continue the conversation around it, right? Because we do want our students to be successful in our classes. And I think it's time for us to rethink some of the more archaic pedagogies that we've been so used to and so ingrained in. So if you enjoyed this episode and you got something out of it, please remember to subscribe to the Higher Ed Institute YouTube channel and like this video so we can appear on your algorithm again. Thank you so much, and we'll see you for the next episode.